Haruki Murakami is probably the world's most well-known Japanese author. His portfolio of short stories, non-fiction, and novels are extremely popular both in Japan and worldwide. His books have been translated into over 50 different languages and sell millions of copies around the globe, and are frequently discussed, analyzed, and sometimes debated. Some of his notable works include Norwegian Wood, Kafka On The Shore, the Windup Chronicle, and the epic 1Q84. He's something of an enigma in the literature scene, an elusive figure rarely appearing in public or in interviews, keeping to himself, mainly writing in the magical realism genre. He occupies a unique space in the literature scene, both writing works that are undeniably unique and like no other, but also happen to appeal to a wider audience and sell incredibly well, covering all kinds of bizarre, obscure, and surreal topics and themes, from talking cats to parallel realities and dried up wells, disappearing women, spaghetti, jazz, ghosts, cults, existential terror, and melancholy. I know there's a lot to dig into, which brings us to the question for this video: where do you even start with Haruki Murakami's work? Welcome to Between the Lines Books and Films. My name is Dylan, and I'm here to share my passion for storytelling with you by exploring iconic books and films. In today's video, I'll be discussing Haruki Murakami, why he's so popular around the world, what makes him stand out amongst his contemporaries, why his style and voice is so unique and moving, and finally, as someone who's read all of Haruki Murakami's work published in English, I'll help guide you on where to start with Haruki Murakami by selecting 5 different books that I think best capture what makes him stand out as an author and act as a kind of entry point into some of his other works. So no matter what kind of reader you are, if you prefer fiction, non-fiction, or short stories, I'll help steer you in what I think is the best direction to get started with his work. He's not a perfect author, but he is my favorite. He's helped me through some really difficult and complex emotions and helped me ultimately grow as a person and understand myself and my place in the world. I won't be discussing any of the more controversial topics that commonly surround his work in this video because I'm not really qualified to do that, and that's not my goal for this channel. But if you are interested in that kind of stuff, there's plenty of resources available on the internet where you can discuss those topics. So without further ado, let's begin. Who is Haruki Murakami? As I'm sure you've gathered, Haruki Murakami is a Japanese author. He was born in Kyoto in 1949, and growing up in a post-World War II Japan, Murakami was exposed to all kinds of influences from Western and European culture, including from jazz music to films and literature, which he became obsessed with, devouring works from all kinds of Western and European authors, including J.D. Salinger, Raymond Chandler, Kurt Vonnegut, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Raymond Carver, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and many, many more. Murakami studied drama at Waseda University and went on to own and run his own jazz bar in Tokyo called Peter Cat, where he spent his time serving clients, preparing food and drinks, and of course listening to jazz music. Murakami didn't start writing until he was 29, when he famously attended a baseball game and witnessed an American baseball player, Dave Hilton, hitting a home run, and it was during this moment that he had the epiphany, watching the ball soar high in the sky, that he decided to try his hand at becoming a novelist. It was possibly this blend of influence from Western and European culture, books, films, and jazz music that he was consuming that led him to develop his own unique style that made him stand out amongst his contemporaries. Murakami writes mainly in the magical realism genre, which blends elements both from the real world with more fantastical, magical, often unexplained elements, fantastical events, characters, and occurrences, and this is quite different from what we are used to with like fantasy, which often takes place in a world that's entirely separate from ours, with fantastical creatures, dragons, orcs, wizards, that kind of stuff. That is not magical realism. Magical realism very much takes place in a grounded reality, and these elements kind of just thrown into the mix, and they're not really explained, they just exist in that space. And in these magical realism stories, cause and effect as we understand it in our world is often disregarded for a more symbolic and metaphorical kind of dream logic that makes sense intuitively and holistically, and it's not really something that's suited for people who like to understand all of the mechanisms behind how something works and why things happen. This is more for people who are maybe more emotional or intuitive. If I had to compare it to any other creator, I would probably say it's quite similar to David Lynch, but maybe a bit more accessible. It's not quite as daunting and surreal as David Lynch can get, although Murakami definitely does get quite surreal sometimes, but he delivers it all in his very accessible style. And it probably sounds more complicated than it is, and what sets it apart from other authors or creators is how accessible it is. He writes in a deceptively simple style, which makes his work easy to get into, easy to follow, and easy to digest. His prose is minimalistic, concise, with unique, vivid metaphors that perfectly convey the characters' feelings, emotions, and what's happening in the scenes, no matter how bizarre or surreal they get. It rarely feels convoluted or difficult to follow, because Murakami is such an expert at describing things. He really gets straight to the point, and often in the most unique and interesting way possible. Don't let me dissuade you from his work by saying it's simple or concise, because that doesn't detract from the emotional richness and depth of his stories. Sure, they're easy to digest, sure they're easy to follow and understand. The simplicity and clarity of his prose might dissuade some people, feeling that it's shallow or superficial, there's no depth to it. But his stories have a way of sticking around in your mind long after you finish reading them, and that's because the actual meaning and subtext behind the stories is actually incredibly rich, with lots of meat on the bones. He covers all kinds of complex themes, from isolation, loneliness, alienation, grief, the passing of time, memory, and the need for human connection. And it never feels like he's trying to preach any of these ideas or force anything down your throat as the reader, because the often surreal and absurd elements of his stories naturally lead you as the reader to ask lots of questions and form your own conclusions, whether it's on a conscious level or it's on a more subconscious level. It's an incredibly gratifying and rewarding experience reading his work, and depending on the way you interpret his stories, you can often come up with many different ways of reading the books. You're not limited to one particular angle on any of the stories, because he does leave them kind of open to interpretation. Never in a pretentious way, not in like an art house kind of artsy-fartsy, like like where you're reaching for some symbolism or something. It's just there, it's very rich, and it's easy to come up with theories because they all seem plausible. And although sometimes the elements of his stories can seem absurd and sometimes random, when you actually start to dig into them, you realize that there is a lot of logic and reason behind those decisions. They're very deliberate, and you can tell that Murakami knows what he's writing about. You can tell he's an incredibly deliberate author. So his work is very easy to follow, very easy to digest, and very easy to think about. The entry point is extremely accessible for readers of all kinds, and the emotional depth is incredibly rich, and you can really go right down the rabbit hole with many of his stories. So where should you start with Haruki Murakami's work? Well, that really depends on what kind of reader you are. As I mentioned, he mainly writes in the magical realism genre, but his stories aren't limited to just that. The way I see it, Murakami's work kind of exists on a spectrum from the more grounded, easy to access stories that don't have any magical realism elements, right down to some that have some little magic realism dotted through them, little taste. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the full mind-bending, surreal, metaphysical epics like 1Q84. Many people kind of break him down into an author who writes two particular types of stories, but I do think he's a lot more diverse than that. He's got a lot of different types of stories to offer, and it's not as simple as saying like realistic and magic realism. There's a lot of nuances, I guess, that go into what set his stories apart within his own bibliography. And although his stories do kind of range from these different more grounded to more magical realism style stories, the one thing that really shines through across the board is his unique style and prose. So let's start right at the beginning of the spectrum with our first recommendation. For those of you who are possibly daunted by the idea of digging into one of his more complex books with magical realism elements, but you still want a taste of his writing style and voice, you can kind of go down two different paths, fiction or non-fiction. So let's start with the fiction path. Book number one. The first book I always recommend is Norwegian Wood. I've already made a separate video on my channel discussing this book in depth, so if you would like to check that out, please feel free. Norwegian Wood is Murakami's most well-known and popular book around the world. It's a coming-of-age story set in 1960s Japan, and it follows Toru Watanabe and his complex relationship with two very different young women. It features zero magical realism elements, and it's probably his most grounded work. It deals with themes of time, grief, memory, and isolation and alienation. in a really beautiful and bittersweet way. It features an interesting cast of characters with unique and distinct voices, and it tells the story through an interesting perspective of an older Toru Watanabe remembering the events of the story after hearing an orchestral rendition of Norwegian Wood during a plane landing in Germany. This is the first Murakami book that I read, and without sounding tacky, it did change my life, because it led me on to read all of his other stories, and it also introduced me to an entire new world of literature, films, and books that I kind of brushed aside because I wrongly convinced myself that I wasn't a reader. The book is simply just really accessible and emotionally rich, and there's a number of different ways to read it. You can either read it as a simple romance story, and you can even read it as a slow burn psychological thriller. I won't explain that, but I will make a separate video on that at some point in the future, so make sure you subscribe to wait and see what I'm meaning by that. But for those of you who maybe prefer non-fiction, you don't have to worry, because Murakami has written a number of really excellent non-fiction books, but my personal recommendation would have to be what I talk about when I talk about running, which is a kind of memoir and reflection on his life both as an author and as a runner, because outside of his literature work, Murakami loves to run. He goes long distance running and frequently participates in marathons and all kinds of triathlons and things. So this is somewhat of a memoir centered around the act of running, but also becomes a parallel to his life as an author, because he draws a distinction between running and the similarities it has to his writing routine. So if you're interested in writing like I am, it's a great insight into how he works and how he develops his stories and stays disciplined, because discipline and routine is probably the hardest part of trying to pursue any creative field. So this is a really great insight into that. I definitely recommend checking it out. It's also a great entry point into his writing style, and it helps you to understand who he is as a person as well, because he's a very unique and eccentric character, and this book kind of sheds some more light on who he is as a person. It's also an excellent audiobook, which I frequently re-listen to. It helps me stay motivated. Okay, so we've tackled some more of his grounded work, but what if you want to get into more of the magical realism that he is well known for? If you're anything like me, you want to dig into the surreal and mysterious stories, and this next recommendation, book number 3, is the perfect example of that, and that of course is Kafka On The Shore. This is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. There's nothing like it, and I absolutely adore it. I reread it frequently. I've read it numerous times. It's my go-to comfort book. Anytime I'm traveling anywhere, I always take it with me and read it on the plane. And each time that I've read it, it still remains really fresh and interesting, and there's stuff that surprises me each time, and there's so much to dig into and think about. It tells 2 alternating stories that interweave and interconnect in really unique and surprising ways. The first story is Kafka Tamura, an extremely intelligent 15-year-old who runs away from home to try and escape the haunting prophecy from his tyrannical father. And the other story is the elderly Nakata who, after a mysterious incident during his childhood, loses many of his cognitive abilities but gains the ability to talk to cats. And I can't really get into this story without spoiling some of the other elements, because there's so much stuff, so many exciting twists and unexpected turns throughout the story that I wish I could go back and experience again without knowing about them in advance, because those stuck with me forever. There's some amazing moments, and you have to experience it for the first time to fully appreciate it. The way this book is written is completely spellbinding in a way that I can only describe as magical. It's so relaxing and thought-provoking. It kind of feels like settling down by a lake and just listening to the waves lapping against the shore. What if you're interested in dipping your toe into his work, but you want something shorter, you don't want to commit to a longer novel? Well, I've got great news for you, because Murakami, as well as having an extensive catalogue of novels and non-fiction, he also writes some amazing short stories, and there's a number of short story collections, and many of these collections feature some of his greatest work, because, you know, with a short story you kind of have the freedom to just focus in on one idea, no matter how random or strange it is. You don't have to commit to an entire novel, and this is where you'll find some of Murakami's most interesting and bizarre stories, which kind of tap into a more whimsical side, which you see pop up occasionally in his novels, but this is where it really shines through. My personal recommendation would have to be Blind Willow's Sleeping Woman, which is an excellent short story collection. It features some of my personal favorite short stories by him, such as Birthday Girl, Toni Takatani, and Hanalei Bay. Definitely check this one out if you're looking for a little tasting selection of Murakami's work. What if you want to dive straight into the deep end, go straight down the rabbit hole, or in this case, the dried up well, straight into the madness, straight into the metaphysical? Book number 5 is The Windup Bird Chronicle. This book is absolutely insane in the greatest way possible. It tells the story of an unemployed man searching for his missing cat, but it quickly devolves into an absurd metaphysical epic that goes off in directions you could never imagine when you first start reading it. Again, this is something you want to go in completely blind, but some elements this story includes stories within stories, metaphysical realms, mysterious shadow figures, dried up wells, jazz, transcendental stuff, and a really sinister undertone of dread and terror under the surface. I don't know what Murakami hooked into with this story, but he got the mix perfectly right. He mixed reality with these metaphysical, magical realism elements perfectly together, and he went into a completely different realm. This story is unlike anything else, and you have to read it. It's incredible. I personally would recommend choosing this as maybe your third or fourth read in his bibliography to fully appreciate it, but sure, if you want to dive straight off the deep end, by all means, start with the Windup Bird Chronicle. So this brings me to the end of my little tour guide on where to start with Haruki Murakami's work. And as I said, this is just the beginning. Many of these stories can act as like a gateway into his other works, which sometimes feature more complex and more absurd elements that you don't find in these particular stories. But these ones I chose, I think, are an excellent entry point. Although I've hyped up the Windup Bird Chronicle as being completely insane, there are many more stories that feature equally insane elements that I am so excited for you to read. Best of luck to you. I really hope you enjoy checking out some of these stories. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and hearing my thoughts on Haruki Murakami. And where do you think you'll start? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear which of these recommendations stuck out to you as the most interesting and made you want to pick up the book and give it a read. And if you are a Murakami fan like myself, you probably are just here to hear someone passionately rant about his work. So let me know in the comments what your favorite Murakami book is, and if there's any other Murakami books you'd like to hear me discuss on this channel, please let me know in the comments. I do plan on covering everything he's published in English because I've read and devoured all of it, and I'm a huge fan. I've got so many thoughts and things I want to discuss, so I'm so excited. I'd like to explore his works on an entry level, such as I have today, but also on a much deeper analytical level as well. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like, a friendly comment, or subscribe for more. This has been Between the Lines Books and Films. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.